My question is something that a lot of people and a lot of parents have to deal with. And I dealt with it in Washington, D.C. when I was in college. So I want to talk about the concept of student housing. I want to know, what's your advice for some college students looking for housing? What's the process? Are there any red flags they should be aware of? And
Yeah,
just maybe you have some input on that.
that's it. First, that's a great question, Melissa. And I specifically, I had gone through it with my kids, and I just did it again, so it was fresh in my mind, and it's something that I wanted to talk to the listeners about. Um, and we're talking now about off-campus housing. I think what happened with my kids is that they went to college, and then they're in the dorms. When you're in the dorms of the school, it's really a system that the dorms have, right? You pretty much you get in the lottery, or you take whatever they have, and you do what you do, and it's really the schools themselves have it included in the tuition or however they handle it, right? So you're not really making an outside deal with another company, right? You're dealing with the school. However, and I think timing is important here because I want to bring that up also. Now you're like, oh, let's say my daughter is a freshman in college, right? And this is her first year. So she started, let's say now it's October, she started in August, right? And the year goes from August to May or May or June, right? And so now she's talking about going off campus. And I'm like, wait a second, you're in the dorm now. What are we talking about? Oh, talking about next year. So I'm like, when is that? Oh, that's next August. Oh, so it's October now. I just got you there, and we're talking about next year.
Wow.
Oh, and oh, it's like, and for my daughter, she was never in this situation before, right? So this is another thing, like I'm trying to do here with everybody. It's like this is the students' first time doing this, right? So there's a lot of things that come up. They don't know, how to handle this, and there's also a demand for housing, right? Student housing that they want. There's pricing that's also expensive, but there's a rush to get the one they want. Uh, so and how they're going to pay for it, fine. But it's in my daughter's position. It was like, oh, this is the one we want, and they're taking reservations now and signing leases now. The landlord for August, July.
Wow.
You're like, okay, I get it. So we signed the lease now for August. So then so really, I want to acknowledge that it's the first time that these kids are, doing something that is, for their own housing, right? And of course, that your parents are co-signers and guarantors, very often, most often, and the student housing companies that handle, off-campus housing, that's a whole business, really, a landlord's another business, and so you say to yourself, fine, you're coming to it as a student, right? It's your first time doing this. Like, have you even looked at a lease before? No, right? So, that's why I encourage people to look at the podcast and say, what are the things I got to think about? How do I know what to do? How do I know what I'm doing? And also, I want to say this, which we should say, most of the student housing is with roommates, right?
Hmm. Definitely.
So you and whatever roommate or roommates you have are sharing and signing on to a lease. Usually you're all responsible jointly and severally, which we had talked about on other podcasts, but there's a whole bunch of things that you want to learn about when you're going into this, which is why we have the podcast. So I'm sure there's a lot of good material here that people can look through of what to think about, what to know when they're signing a lease, right? So with my daughter, I said, okay, it's a 40-page lease. You should print it out and read it. If you have questions, let me know. Like, and then we're going to go through it together, right? So I, obviously I do this for a living, so I print out the lease myself, and I'm the guarantor. Like I have to sign. So with her, so I'm like, uh, so let's go through it now. These days, and it's much different than it used to be. Everything's electronic. Also, you just click and sign, right? So a lot of days people don't even read stuff. So you're signing a 40-page plus lease, and you like click and you signed it. I'm like, really? So take your time, breathe, read the important parts that you need to know, such as, what's the start and end date.
Right. So is that semester based or is it yearly?
Great question. So
I don't remember.
let me tell and then my daughter didn't even realize. So I'm like telling you, okay, so she goes to rent an apartment, right? So in this lease, fine, and it's furnished. So that's one thing to realize. There's furniture included. And she says, okay, well, my semester is August to May. I said, okay, this lease is from August to the end of July. So I go, you were paying for 2 months that you're not there. And by the way, we start paying in July. So you're like almost you're renting it for 12 months, but you're really only using it for 9 months. Now, that begs the question is that, what can you do with the other 3 months? I mean, you still have the place. Can you take a summer course, or are you going to, or do you have a job or assignment or whatever that you could do? Like when I went to college, I took summer courses because, really the summer starts July, let's say July 4th for you, for yourself. But, you're like, oh, I'm done with school in May. I could do some classes for 6 weeks. That's just, I'm bringing it up as things to think about. But, my daughter wasn't thinking about that. She's like, oh, I'm like, oh, I think I'm getting it for the semester. I'm like, no, you're signing up for 12 months. We're paying for 12 months. The landlord is renting it for a year, right? But 9-month deals, interesting. So what I'm having it now, of course, it differs from place to place and all that. And people do in college towns, they do only rent for 9 months sometimes. But you have to know that, right? And if you're a landlord or property owner that's renting to college kids, you want to have certain protections there that help you get to the next step. Also, it's like on the one hand, you're dealing with people that are first-time renters, right? They're really the first time in their life. So you want to make sure that they're protected, that you're protected, that you have the proper rules in place, and as a renter for the first time, you want to make sure that you're being taken care of in the right way, also, right? So there's a lot. So those kind of things to look out for in the big picture. What, of course, we said this before in prior episodes. Like, what am I responsible for? What are the rules? What can I do? What am I allowed to do? What can't I do? What do I have to ask permission for? How do things get? What services are included? What do I have to take care of by myself? What about access at the end of the lease, which we talked about in the previous episode? When do I have to be out by? When can I go take possession by? What do I do about the utilities? All those questions are it's a lot for someone who hasn't ever done it before, right? So what I would suggest is, now, I would think that people who are doing this for the first time should ask for help, right?
Absolutely.
Should ask their parents, should ask their friends and say, you could have a lawyer look at it. Very often, these leases are in a form that they're not negotiated, right? Because the landlord's signing the same lease format with a lot of people, and they have their rules and way of doing things. Usually when it's a big landlord, like a big owner of, let's say, a student housing complex or something. But then there's also individual, houses that we've rented off campus, where It could be a smaller landlord, things like that. Or if you're a landlord if you're an owner that owns a house and you want to rent it, like let's say you guys wanted to rent your house to student housing. Okay, so there's rules you're gonna make. You're like, no party, like not no parties, but you know, you're concerned about the furniture that you're leaving behind if you are, and that's typical in student housing where there's furniture left, for the like it's furnished. So you want to make sure that your things are taken care of. You want to make sure that the people who are using it are responsible, not to damage it. And look, who's going to blame kids like that? It's like the first time they're getting out, they want to exercise a little bit of freedom and do their own thing, and maybe they want to paint the wall purple. You're like, thank you. And if you're an owner, and on the one hand, you realize that people want to have their own thing, but make sure it's put back in the way that they got it right. But you might make rules about those things. So
And another thing that I don't think you mentioned, but something to look out for is if the landlord will allow for subletting, because I know I did that.
that's a big.
I subletted to someone because a lot of kids in college work or
You're right.
yeah,
And I think that's fairly common. Like, uh, what happens is, let's say, and I did this with my daughter, my other daughter. She was like, "Oh, I'm renting this place for a year." We made a commitment, right? And we made the commitment as we were just discussing, you know, several months before she moved in, right? Now, these kids, they don't know what they're doing, tomorrow. Like, do they know what they're doing in 8 months from now, right?
exactly.
So my daughter decided to study abroad, right? So now you're realizing now she didn't. When did she decide to? She could have decided that in a few months, and then, but that's for a year from now. So she's in a lease. She committed now in October for a lease in next July, and then in January of the following year, she wants to go a semester abroad. I'm like,
But you still have the
but you
apartment.
still have the place you committed to. So how do you work that out with your roommates? So and your landlord, like the landlord has to be. So the lease, to your point, usually there's real rules about that, and you have to have a conversation with your roommates about um, plans like that, and with your landlord about replacing yourself for a period of time. In my daughter's case, she before we signed the lease, she knew that she was going to do that. So she spoke to her roommates about the possibility, and they had someone, and it was on her to find someone else. And also that had to work with the roommates, and the landlord was agreeable to such things. So those are important considerations to work out. And the more in advance, the better. And the more you communicate with those about those, the better. They happen a lot, and that's part of student housing, the flexibility and stuff. So very often they allow those things, but you need to ask permission of the landlord. And of course, there's more of a complexity with the roommate situation where you're like, oh, you got involved with a roommate that you knew, and then now you want them to live with somebody else, and how does that work? Did you have a it's a lot. It's not so straightforward.
Right. So this goes in the theme of our podcast of just over communication is always best usually. And I think I love how you make your daughter read the lease because my dad made me do that for everything. He's like, if you have questions, let me know. And it's just a good life lesson to start learning real life experience, hands on, that you can't learn in the college classroom.
It
So,
is. It's serious, and I think it's to be taken seriously. It's a big financial commitment, and so for some people, it's the first big commitment they're making. Of course, they're going to school, but their names on it, and sure, their parents are also co-signing. But you know, you got to sit down and try, really read it and understand it, and give it attention and respect that it deserves, because you're making, this is a contract that you're entering into, maybe the first one ever, right? So, and it's scary, and new, and it's a good process. And it's also very exciting to be, doing that, really on your own for the first time. And it's certainly good practice for life, right? It's a little bit of a safe place. Like when you go to college, you're moving out for the first time, you're on campus. Then that's like a transition to, okay, well, I did the on campus thing in the campuses thing, and now I'm going to do something off campus. And then you're going to get to life. When you graduate, you're like, I get my own place, and I did it before. So you sort of use it as a practice to get to that. So I think uh, that's how it's a context for a good way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.